Great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. So I got asked to talk about the ramifications of the Iranian nuclear deal for the regional ramifications of the Iranian nuclear deal, so in the Middle East. But before I can even get to those, there's a couple things I want to make clear, is that for the moment there actually is no Iranian nuclear deal. There is no agreement. The president came out on April 2nd, Rose Garden press conference, but there actually is no joint written text. Part of the reason you've seen the Iranians and the United States come out with very different interpretations of what they think they agreed to is because there was no single authoritative thing that they agreed to. The points of disagreement are not about details, but about core issues. It's unclear that if those disagreements haven't changed in the last 18 months that these negotiations have been going on, it's unclear why they would change over the next 2.5 when they're supposed to conclude by June 30th. And the other thing we should keep in mind is that it is entirely possible that Iran is not interested in a final deal, period. Doesn't matter what the terms are, it's not interested in a final deal, period. Because if you look at it from their perspective, the negotiations alone have been a net plus for them. And so what do I mean by that? Is that if you look at the situation in 2013, summer 2013, right before these negotiations were started, their economy was in the tank. Additional sanction legislation had been passed by the House, threatened to pass by the Senate. The United States, the credibility of the United States military option, this is before the Syrian Red Line fiasco, was still there. And if you look at the position now, as the Iranian economy has rebounded pretty significantly, both in 2014 and 2015. That's despite the steep drop in the price of oil. Additional sanctions were forestalled, and the current sanctions have been relaxed. In the meantime, they've been made more both progress on their nuclear program and progress as well on their military program in terms of ballistic missile research. And the threat of U.S. military action is off the table. The Iranian position today is incomparably better to where it was about 1.5 years ago. So it is entirely possible that the Iranians, no matter what the United States offers to them, will say that they've gained immeasurably in this 2-year period. So rather than focus on the details in the negotiations, I want to turn to the security implications of this deal and what it means. And in one word, the security implications are really bad, or bad, that's one word. In 2 words, they're really bad, very bad. And it's for 3 overarching reasons. One is that it increases the likelihood of regional conflicts. 2, it increases the likelihood of nuclear proliferation, both in the region and without. And 3, it makes reestablishing the status quo ante nearly impossible. So I'd like to kind of go through those 3 things. So first, why does it increase the likelihood of regional conflict? Well, part 1 is that the Iranians are likely to act more aggressively rather than less. Iran believes that it can use its assets and proxies in the region, such as the Assad regime, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Iraqi Shiite militias, etc. They can have them lean forward because they know that others will be hesitant in challenging them for fear of triggering a bigger or wider conflict with an Iran that has a widespread nuclear program. It can also rile up Shiites in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain. Those are all the major oil-producing regions of those states. It can also act to provoke the United States in the Persian Gulf. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, an Iranian helicopter buzzed an American ship operating in the Gulf. You might remember a few years ago some of the swarming maneuvering that small Iranian littoral ships were doing in the Gulf, and the United States was sort of unsure how to respond. This deal will make them more willing to do all those things. The second reason that it actually will create a more unstable region is what our allies, specifically Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others, might do to mitigate the worst effects of this deal. If they're not able to actually stop the deal from happening, which is what they've been trying to do, they will act to secure their own interests before the worst aspects of the deal are in place. And so how does this go, or what does this mean? The Arab intervention that you've seen in Yemen for the past 3 weeks is one very prominent example of that. It is impossible to look at what is going on there without the context of the ongoing nuclear negotiations. I mean, the Saudis see that as an Iranian outpost on its southern border, on a strategic waterway. The Saudis had, part of the concern about the Iranian position in the Persian Gulf and the oil transiting through the Gulf is the Saudis for years had been investing in building basically a trans-Arabian pipeline to basically allow them to avoid going through the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Where does the pipeline go? It goes into the Red Sea. Where does Egypt get shipped out from? Where does oil get shipped out there from there? Either the Suez Canal or the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the waterway basically between Yemen and the Horn of Africa. Well, if the Saudis feel like the Iranians have an outpost on the Horn of Africa or on the Middle Eastern side of the Horn of Africa, well then they've kind of sort of outflanked the Saudis' effort to outflank them in the first place. So the Saudis see that very seriously. And for the record, we don't know where this intervention in Yemen is going to go. It's entirely unclear if it'll actually be successful. I mean, they've been there for a month. It's unclear how many casualties they've been. It's unclear how much progress they've made. In the meantime, Al-Qaeda in Yemen has used it as an opportunity to make its own gains. I mean, this is a mess, and it could go in a lot of different directions. For its part, Israel could very much act in a similar fashion. I mean, at the moment, there's no government in Israel as a result of the elections, but over the next month, there will be a government. Once that government is formed, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a reevaluation of its strategy along its northern border. For the last 6 years, the Israeli strategy along its border with Lebanon and with Syria has been to seek quiet, is to try not to react to provocations in order to keep the eye on the ball of basically stopping the Iranian nuclear program. The idea was that, yes, if you take on Hezbollah, less you take on Assad, it certainly weakens Iran, but it doesn't actually stop the Iranian nuclear program. And if anything, it might sour relations with the United States, who you are counting on to try and help you stop the Iranian nuclear program. But if that's off the table, Israel might be more willing to act aggressively and respond to provocations along its northern border in order to mitigate possible future effects of the Iranian deal. So you possibly see that in both circumstances. Third, another reason why conflict will be more likely is that this deal will actually, while it will embolden the Iranians to be aggressive, it will actually cause the United States to be more hesitant. Why? Because the Obama administration will seek to protect the arrangement. I mean, this is a crown jewel of a diplomatic effort it's worked on for years, even before there were actual negotiations. It will try to eliminate or dampen other potential points of friction between itself and the Iranians that it believes might cause Iran to walk away from the deal. So you can already see now, even before there is no deal, how U.S. policy both in Syria and Iraq have changed, I would say, over the last couple of years from where it was beforehand in order to coordinate or cooperate with, depending on what word you'd rather use, with Iranian policies in both places. Imagine that continuing on steroids. The United States has already backed down from criticizing Iranian anti-Semitic rhetoric and other nefarious Iranian actions. Just a couple data points. The White House, when a couple weeks ago, when the Supreme Leader of Iran said death to Israel, death to America, which they do all the time, and he's not the only one, the White House line from the White House press spokesman was, don't pay attention, it's kind of the don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain, arrangement. Is the line was saying it was intended for a domestic political audience, and it wasn't something to be worried about from the United States. When Senator McCain, pointed to the criticisms or different interpretations of the deal that was coming out of Tehran, the White House press spokesman said it was, and I quote, "It was naive and reckless for McCain to believe every word of the Supreme Leader's political speech. He shouldn't." So the United States already is trying to disassociate or disconnect some of the rhetoric and other actions coming from the regime in order to try and protect this nuclear accord. That extends to what it will do to, maybe the appropriate term is box out American allies who are trying to impact it. So particularly talk about Israel. So one would expect that during these negotiations, especially with other allies, the United States were to sign something that allies are worried about, it would seek to try and comfort them. It would seek to try to mitigate them. It would seek to try and protect them from the worst effects, understand their concerns. Instead, the White House is reacting the opposite way, which is trying to pressure them and silence them. So you see the Obama administration harsh criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu's election rhetoric, and how it's tried to keep that up. That's one way of trying to silence criticism of the Iran deal. The United States has threatened to reassess ties with Israel. Reassess is a big word in the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's sort of a key word that makes Israelis think back to 40 years ago, basically, in 1975, when the Ford administration threatened to reassess ties with Israel over what it saw was Israeli intransigence in its negotiations, in disengagement of forces negotiations with Egypt at the time, and Syria. And it has basically threatened to throw Israel to the wolves at the United Nations. All these things are in a way to try and box the Israelis out from somehow upsetting the agreement. And to relate it to the first point, if Israel, it's my own opinion, if Israel were to try and act more aggressively to protect its interests along its northern border, I think you'll actually see the administration try and snip it in the bud or try and control it rather than actually support it and say, maybe it's not such a bad deal to take out an Iranian proxy before they get too powerful. The silver lining in that is that you do have a mutuality of interests between Israel and some of the conservative Sunni states in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and in some cases other Gulf countries. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes cooperation. It's unclear whether that would go public at any point, and it's unclear to what extent those ties might actually bring about a useful outcome. The second reason this deal is very bad, or the implication of the deal is very bad, is it also increases the likelihood of nuclear proliferation in the region. The deal itself is not only too weak to stop the Iranians from acquiring a bomb if they cheat on the deal, it also gives Iran a legitimate path to nuclear weapons even if they adhere to the deal. The president himself in an NPR interview last week basically admits the fact, the bigger concern is in 13, 14, 15 years, in this deal, the Iranian breakout time will be basically zero. They tried to walk it back and said, no, we meant without the deal. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So it's a concern that even if the Iranians adhere to the deal, which the United States have a more difficult problem criticizing once that happens, that Iran will get the bomb. Moreover, every single Middle East state will demand the same deal. They will look and for example, the UAE, which already has a nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States, similar to one that the United States has negotiated with South Korea, among others in the world that it's working on, they will say, wait a minute, we abide by your strict interpretations and we don't even get to enrich. The Iranians are a state sponsor of terror. They act against American interests all around the region, and you grant them a right to enrich and a wide industrial-scale nuclear program in their soil. At the very least, we're going to have the same thing. The Saudis explicitly, Saudi foreign minister multiple times, have explicitly said, whatever the outcome of this deal is, we will demand the exact same thing, and they have the ability to get it. A number of other regional countries have already established nuclear programs, ostensibly for civilian purposes at this moment, but we don't know where that leads. Even small countries, we're talking about Jordan. U.S. allies, this is not just nefarious actors, U.S. allies, Jordan, the UAE, Egypt, Kuwait, Turkey, they've all talked about it, and some of them do have plans for nuclear reactors on their soil. Finally, the third reason is that this deal makes rebooting or restoring the U.S. position in the region much, much harder. So nearly all Republican presidential candidates have basically declared that if they were to win the presidency, they'd scrap the deal on day one. Even if they were to win, and if they do that, which I think is doubtful, I think a lot of times things have a life of their own, and once you come into power, it's much more difficult to undo something so quickly. But even if they do that, or if this White House or the next one catches the Iranians cheating on the agreement, uses an excuse to try and walk out of the deal, the return to the status quo ante of before the deal was in place is nearly impossible. Verification of Iranian cheating would become a political football. You can look at the experiences that we've had dealing with the Iraqis or dealing with the North Koreans. You catch them doing something, you bring it up to them, they said, we don't know what you're talking about. Can you give us more information? Wait a couple weeks. What is it? Let me look into it. Wait a couple weeks. It was an accident. Come back to them. The U.S. says, it wasn't an accident. What is this? Wait a couple weeks. Oh, you're right. We were cheating. But you've wasted 2 or 3 months to even get there. And that's even before this then has to go and be verified by various UN powers, the Chinese and the Russians. This is a whole do-si-do that is unending, which was part of the problem, I think, in the weapons verification inspections regime after Iraq. Even if everybody were to agree that the Iranians were cheating, the ability to snap back or reimpose quickly the UN sanctions, for starters, i.e. getting the Russians and the Chinese to agree to reimpose them, I'm willing to put, I'll bet whoever you want, I'm willing to put money that that'll never happen. When the Russians and the Chinese signed up to these UN sanctions, those go back as far as 2006. That was 10 years ago. Doesn't seem like that long ago. That was 10 years ago. The Russians and the Chinese are in a very different place today than they were 10 years ago, especially on this issue. And the United States is also, for that matter. Second, even Congress, in terms of U.S. sanctions, Congress, we're in Congress. Congress moves fairly slowly, even when it has the best of intentions. You could even have a White House that opposes Congress moving, just like this White House opposed congressional Iran sanctions, kind of fought it kicking and screaming for a few years. Even in the best case scenario of lining up lining all those ducks up in the right order, there is no way that Iran would feel the economic pressure of reimposed sanctions fast enough to make them want to walk back the nuclear breakout or sneak out that they have been doing. To give an example, we've had, the nuclear-related sanctions on Iran, like I said, begun basically roughly a decade ago. And even if you buy the reason they came to negotiations was because of these sanctions, it took 10 years, it took multiple rounds of sanctions, it took the somewhat devastating oil, banking, and financial sanctions in 2012 to even get them that far. If it takes you a few months to verify what's going on, if it takes you a few more months to reestablish the political coalition, both domestically and internationally, to be able to do that, by the time it would take for sanctions to be reimposed, the Iranians might say, we can handle the pain for a little longer. We're this close. What's the bother? So even the best case scenario is very difficult. Secondly, there's no really useful precedent for undoing another country's nuclear progress, absent at least the threat of the use of force or a change in regime. If you look just historically in terms of the countries that have gone up to a certain ledge or have even gone over the ledge and walked back, there's either been the threat of the use of force, the use of force, in terms of the Israeli case in Iraq and Syria, or the threat of the use of force, basically, in terms of the lessons the Gaddafi regime drew from American involvement in Iraq beforehand, or even supposedly the Iranians drew back in 2003, or it's regime change. It's the fall of the Soviet Union caused a number of these Soviet nuclear weapons that were stationed in what became independent states to be able to reach deals to retract those. There is no precedent for dealing with the Iranians unless you're willing to at least threaten force credibly, or unless you think that there might be some sort of change of regime from within. And finally, earning back the trust of our allies will also be very difficult. I think the Red Line episode in Syria had a profound effect, one that we still don't realize here, but had a profound effect on how a lot of states in the region saw American credibility, American red lines. These states will have already made decisions to try and mitigate the deal, and it sends those decisions, whether it's developing their own nuclear program, acting in the region, those decisions will send them down a very different path that's very difficult for us to get them to walk back. So just in conclusion, to talk about the deal, in my book, there's only one actor that can stop this deal from happening, and that's Iran itself. They may very well not want a deal, period, or never have wanted one. Or they very well could have walked away in June, and they expect the administration might go back to them a month later with additional concessions. But that's in my mind, that's it. So from our perspective is, in addition to hearing our allies' concerns about the deal itself, I would suggest that there's at least a second track that should be going on in terms of what we can do with our allies to try and mitigate some of the worst effects of these deals. And some of the effects that I've lined out, which are also bad in terms of additional instability, try and work with our allies who are worried about it to try and help them overcome some of the second-order effects of what a more aggressive or what an Iran on steroids would look like after a deal. So I hope that provided a useful overview, and happy to take questions, concerns, and talk a little bit more.
Gabe, thank you. Before I open the floor, just a quick comment and then a question. It occurs to me that this month marks the 6-year anniversary of the speech that President Obama gave in Prague, the first year of his presidency, where he said he envisioned the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. As misguided as that statement is, I find it ironic that his Iran policy is bringing about the very world that he thought his worldview was going to avoid, which is to say a widespread nuclear proliferation in some of the most dangerous parts of the world, which you alluded to so nicely. My question is, what in your view is the outlook for an Israeli strike on Iran to try to at least roll back part of the nuclear weapons program? What is the likelihood that they would do it, and what do you think the ramifications of that might be?
Well, for a couple caveats. First, I'm not a military analyst, so I wouldn't want to speculate over actual capabilities and the balance of forces and all the factors that go into that. You talk to Israelis who do this for a living, and they say it can be done, but they don't like to necessarily talk about it. So I could at least answer what I think some of the political calculi and political ramifications might be. I have a hard time believing that no matter what the deal looks like and no matter the international pressure and how bad relations between the Netanyahu government and the Obama administration might get, I have a hard time believing that the Israelis would be willing to live with an Iranian bomb, period. I mean, they've said it over and over again. They have a track record to prove it. They see it as, I think these days, as their sole existential threat. They think they have the capabilities to do it. Now, how they might go about doing it, I think the stereotypical view is, sort of a single-shot, massive Israeli aerial strike. But there are a lot of other capabilities that they have that, they don't talk about as much. I mean, even things that, and this goes into a whole nother topic, but even things like, cyber warfare, sabotage operations, things like that don't necessarily involve an overt kinetic military strike in that purpose. And in many ways, they've done some of that over the years in order to try and retard the Iranian progress. But in terms of political ramifications, again, it depends on how it's done. I don't think that an Israeli strike would necessitate an immediate Iranian response necessarily. The Iranians historically have often acted indirectly through proxies. You see it in Iraq, you see it in Lebanon, even in Syria. You see it in terms of how they've sponsored terrorism abroad. They've tried to make it so that their fingerprints are less on it, even while accomplishing their goals. So from the Israeli perspective, I think there's the two biggest calculations for them in terms of whether they're willing to launch a strike or willing to do it is, one, what does the international diplomatic situation look like for them? And two is, what kind of blowback can they handle, mostly what they think is from Hezbollah at this point. On the Hezbollah front, the missile defense capabilities that they've been investing in and testing and succeeding, including one, the Iron Dome is the famous one that's been operational and wildly successful for 4 years now almost, but they have a few others coming online, including one that's meant to deal with basically some of the short-range and medium-range stuff that Hezbollah has. David Sling's supposed to come online basically next year. That could be a game changer from the Israeli perspective in terms of what they think they can deal with on the home front from Hezbollah in order to give them the time to deal with the blowback. On the international situation, I think it depends. I think they probably believe that whatever administration is next would be more conducive and helpful to doing that, but I don't know if they think they would be willing to wait another 20, 24, 30 months to get that far.
Fred.
The thing that caught my eye when the Saudi Arabia formed the mostly Arab coalition against the Iran plus the framework agreement is that they enlisted the support of Pakistan. Now, Pakistan's the only Muslim country with nuclear weapons. What's the possibility that if Iran gets on the pathway of nuclear weapons, that Pakistan will sell Saudi Arabia either the technology or a bomb itself? Pakistan, I believe, has something on the order of 130 weaponized nuclear weapons.
So the not-so-secret story about that is that it is widely understood that the Pakistani nuclear program itself was heavily invested in by the Saudis, and that when the time would come, if Saudi Arabia would so request it, that the Pakistanis would basically sort of give them their investment and what they came out of that. And I have no further insight on what's there. One interesting tidbit, though, is that just this week, when it came to the coalition the Saudis have been building in terms of in Yemen, and they announced 10 or 11 states that support them, including Pakistan, as you peel back the layers of the onion, not only did it seem like Pakistanis haven't sent anything, but they took a vote in their parliament just the other day that actually opposed Pakistani involvement in this war. And so you've had some pretty nasty comments coming out of Saudi ministers about how ungrateful the Pakistanis are and so on and so forth. And the Pakistanis are saying, we're neighbors with the Iranians. You want us to fight so far away from our borders against the Iranians who are on our borders? So again, I have no particular additional insight to there. It's certainly a very real threat. It's one the Saudis will cite when talking about how they would react to an Iranian nuclear bomb. Maybe that data point about how that cooperation has, if that cooperation will be sustained following Saudi intervention in Yemen, who knows whether that'll have an impact.
John.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to ask from a United States point of view, this is a very sort of hard-line idea. Might it not be a really good thing if there's a Sunni-Shia clash in Yemen and maybe Syria, and Obama has fumbled everything, but it is always possible that by our not being there, they got to be there, and that clash has it lines up enough that the Iranians may be kicked out of some of the places that they shouldn't be.
I mean, it's an argument that gets cited a lot, and one I'm not, one I sometimes am sympathetic to. The issue is a couplefold. One is that it assumes that these two actors are always at odds with each other, and they often aren't. They often will cooperate. So even in Syria, for example, you've seen evidence of the Assad regime, an Alawite, Shiite, heterodox offshoot regime, in some ways cooperating with ISIS in order to deal with the other Sunni rebel groups, facilitating oil sales from one area to the other, helping with movement troops, not targeting each other. And ISIS is about as radical as you can possibly get, and the Assad regime is supposedly this secular Shiite regime. So you see cooperation there, and even in and we have I know it got kind of blown out of proportion in the lead up to Iraq, but we had widespread evidence that Iran had given safe haven to members of Al Qaeda. So just because this divide is obviously real and historical and absolutely important and does motivate a lot of things, we do have plenty of time. Iran is one of the main funders and arming supporters of Hamas. I mean, we see these things cross borders. So to assume that they will necessarily fight to the death and leave us totally out of it, I'm not so sure. And the second thing is that, and this you also see evidence of it in Syria, the spillover is not necessarily containable. In Syria, not only do you have 220,000 deaths over the last 4 years, I think that just passed that number this week, but you have 1 million refugees in Jordan. Jordan is a population of 4 or 5 million people, and that's 25% of your population. It's refugees. You have 1 million plus refugees in Lebanon. Lebanon, I think, is a population of 5 or 6 million. I mean, you now, Lebanon, which used to be this sort of chaotic, ethnically mixed state between Sunnis and Shiites and Christians, there's no question that it is now an overwhelmingly Sunni state, just simply because of those refugees. Turkey, you have another, 1.5 million or 2 million refugees in Turkey. All these refugees aren't going anywhere because this conflict isn't ending tomorrow. They're going to be there for the long haul, and it can have very disastrous effects on the stability of other states in the region, such as Jordan, which is a close, not only Israeli partner, but U.S. allies. So on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to the arguments, a pox on both their houses, or what's the Sarah Palin line? It's like, let Allah figure it out, or something like that. But there are very real ramifications of encouraging that or letting that go, out of control, and I don't think we want to go down that road.
Okay, so we have time for one more question for Gabe, if there is one. And if not, Gabe, just wait for the mic if you would.
A few years back, I supported the Chief of Staff of the Air Force's directed worldwide counterforce study. And that was our ability to find weapons of mass destruction, plan against weapons of mass destruction, execute, and then assess what we did. And in terms of any kind of strike, again, currently what the Iranians have, with their lessons learned of how we've responded against target sets, I'll tell you, even for us to do it would be extremely difficult, and for the Israelis to do it. And then you talk about blowback. Right now, I guess the polls are showing that 76% of the American public support the treaty with Iran. If you have a unilateral strike by Israel, what's the potential blowback on the part of the American public of saying, you're starting another war in the Middle East that we're going to get drug into. We're going to shut off all our funding for F-35s, all our funding for your V-22s, everything else that you want.
I mean, at the end of the day, it really depends on the context in which such a potential strike would occur, right? I mean, and frankly, the results. The Israeli strike on the Syrian nuclear reactor 8 years ago, it was it wasn't even a blip on the radar screen, right? It was nothing. The American people, I would be curious if someone even polled any the American people what happened or what they thought about the Israeli strike there, because it was done under, it was covert basically, and it wasn't talked about, and it was only 3 weeks later that anybody even revealed it. So I'm not saying that Iran is going to be that easy or in the same way, of course not, but it really depends on the context. If it's done in the context of Iranian cheating, that's very different. If it's done in the context of more aggressive Iranian activity or more aggressive Iran sponsored activity by Hezbollah, it's very different. If it's done under the context of American failure to beat back ISIS, I mean, there's a lot of variables in here that really matter. But to go back to your first point about in your comment, it's really interesting in the sense that there's a debate. In some ways, it's an intellectual one at this point, but it's one that I think could have very real ramifications over what is the impact in Iran over, let's say, an Israeli or an American strike. Some people will say that, well, there'll be a rally around the flag effect, basically, is that if there's one way you want to cement this regime's, it's been in power 35, 36 years, if you want to cement this regime's additional 35 or 36 years, especially after it's weak, especially after it's disgraced, especially it's unpopular, then one way to do it is attack it. That's one aspect. The other that I think is held on to by some Israelis is that actually if you commit a successful strike, it doesn't have to wipe out the whole nuclear program, but something that shows that Iran is a paper tiger, sort of the emperor has no clothes, then in fact the regime will be exposed as the weak regime that it is, and that it will actually encourage additional opposition from inside the state. The opposition groups that do exist, Iranians on the streets, those sorts of mechanisms. I mean, at this point, it's an intellectual debate. It's unknowable, and it would be wise to game it out with folks who have a very good understanding of Iranian culture and how people react. But I think there are people in Israel who would argue that you don't have to physically eliminate every single site, every single nuclear site, every single ballistic missile site, every single oil refinery, every single whatever you want to call it to weaken them, is that if you do it in such a way, then there might be political dynamics that take care of themselves.
Okay. Well, Gabe, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.